Angus, when I was on the planning board 20 years ago with Bill O'Neill as the president, as the chair, I said to Bill, you've got to allow one joke a meeting.
We
So
can do better than that.
we had well, that was the minimum.
Okay, okay.
So we've reached the minimum in very short order here.
Excellent.
Yeah, I mean,
I will say I am less in a jokey mood by like 9 p.m. on a Wednesday night. So
yes, I can see that would be the case.
Okay, hello everyone. Oh wait, we're all here. Excellent. Welcome. This is the Housing and Zoning Subcommittee of the Amherst Planning Board. Today is Thursday, February 12th, 2026. It is 11:40 a.m. We are meeting virtually and we will just dive right in. Let's see. Let's see anyone attending, just so everybody's aware. Nobody listening in today. We'll just get started with the agenda. I don't have any announcements. Nate, do you have anything for us or anyone else?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that Jeff Bagg is attending the CRC meeting this afternoon and discussing planning department priorities and just kind of outlining what we'd like to do this year. I've spoken with Doug, and I think what we're hoping is to have the planning board and CRC meet a few times before things become official zoning amendment, right? And try to just keep everyone up to date on what's happening. So just maybe a little different process than what we've done in the past. I mean, we're just trying to come up with ideas. So, if the housing subcommittee, if we work on a few things, we bring it to the planning board, and maybe if the planning board says yes, then we would try to involve CRC or other stakeholders and get some ideas before we then try to get it referred to council. So just, even if we meet with other stakeholders too, just trying to come up with different ideas.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach. What time is that meeting?
It's at 1:00 today.
Probably can't devote much more of my day, but maybe I'll listen in. Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, I guess that would be. I assume the idea is to get some broader agreement, so that when it gets to council, there's more of a likelihood it moves forward. Is that the thinking?
Yeah, or just so that everyone is aware of it, right? I think what happened with University Drive and even with more recent zoning amendments, the planning board and now the subcommittee might spend a lot of time discussing something, but it gets referred to council and then the CRC hasn't really discussed it. And so they might want to spend 6 months, whereas, the planning board's already spent 6 months. And so, yeah, it's just, we've done it before. A few years ago, we tried to have a little bit more kind of periodic updates to each board, and I think we're just trying to get back there.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, makes sense. Anything else from anybody?
Not from me.
Okay.
I was just gonna add, Jesse, I have to leave early as well, around the same time. So
Okay, well, let's plan to finish then.
Sure. So we've got basically an hour. So which is fine. There's no minutes to approve yet. Apologies once more. Well, yes, that's all there is to say. Hopefully no one will start asking for them. Okay, discussion of general zoning priorities. So Nate, do you want to lead this about really what we want to do first? I assume is the big question.
Sure. Yeah, I sent around a few documents. I can share my screen, and some of it would be just, looking at the, five there, make sure, we like the order. If we want to, just discuss what are the first few priorities. I think around student housing, I was hoping we could spend some time talking about what are the questions we want to have answered. And I started just writing some down, and for mixed use buildings, what does that mean for changes in the outlying village centers?
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, even, just kind of a discussion about each of those and, things to research or to refine what, I kind of put in what I thought was my understanding of them, and, we can just walk through them.
Yeah, great. So why don't we try for 10 minutes on each of these, maybe?
Okay.
And let me just pull up my screen.
Which first?
And this is really just to set the stage for us to move forward, right? I mean, it's like,
Right. And
okay,
yeah, and I think some of it, if we go back to the planning board at the next meeting or the subsequent meeting, just say, here's, we can give them an update. We're trying to get more time on the agenda for the full board and say, maybe here's our ideas about mixed use buildings. Here's our
okay,
ideas of how we'd want to, our ideas about students, right? Whatever that may end up being,
yeah,
and just see how the board feels about it.
okay.
And so if this is visible for everyone, so for mixed use buildings, that was one. The question is, we have, this 30%. It can't be waived. And so mixed use buildings are allowed in a few zoning districts, and so apartments are not, and then they're capped at the number of units per building, and so we find mixed use buildings are more advantageous. We've heard from different stakeholders and folks that the 30% is difficult to get projects financed or just to move forward. We had a new standard for the University Drive overlay, 75% of the street facing facade to a depth of like 24 feet or something. And then we also had a condition in that overlay that, like, to the extent feasible, so essentially, given any land use constraints, that a building would be developed along the frontage, right, along the width of the property. So someone's not coming in here and trying to be creative and have the narrow end of the building
Right.
face the street.
Right.
And so we already have two standards in the bylaw. So the question is kind of, are there other standards we want to use?
I mean, yeah, so I guess I have mixed feelings about this, to be totally honest. If we are talking about actually in town centers, part of me wants to say, okay, make it 100% of the frontage and figure out some formula that makes it reasonable, right? Like I would ask, why do we need an apartment on the first floor facing the street? Because that's what'll happen, right? With any space that's left over. And I'm thinking about what's the real goal here? Because again, I think if developers are saying this doesn't work for us, that's because they know they can get more money with more apartments. Maybe I have a cynical view on this, but again, just looking at the projects over the last more than a couple of years, how long things sit vacant. And, we've debated this in various circles, but is it because it's just not that important because of the finances of everything else? Or, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. So again, I'm mixed about making it more flexible and eliminating commercial space because I think that's really important for a downtown.
Yes, I have the same view, Jesse. I had Mandy Joe uh, buttonholed me about a year ago we had a long, close to an hour conversation in the coffee shop, and she was making the case for eliminating or changing, and I basically said it's a vitality question. That was what drove us on University Drive. We didn't want to give up the prospect of vitality on the street, and that was very popular on the board at the time, and I think with people in the attendees. And I made the case with Mandy Joe. I said, well, it might not be that they can put a tenant in there immediately, but we assumed that that the economics of the whole project wasn't going to be vitiated by this particular requirement. And even if it wasn't filled for the first few years, in the fullness of time, we felt that this was an important thing. And I would need to be persuaded that I was wrong in my. I mean, I didn't convince Mandy Joe, I don't think, but I convinced her that there was a serious argument as to why this proposition was in place and why it should stay this way. We can chew around the edges. As you say, maybe it changes with outlying districts or it's different in outlying districts and so forth. But it's so I think we should discuss this at the whole board, I guess. But uh, I
What,
think this is a question that is chewed around the edges, or I need to be it needs to be explained to me why the economic feasibility of developing new buildings in town is dependent on making this 30% thing go away or go down to almost nothing. I don't know. I have to be convinced of that. It seems to me to be.
Brad, I see your hand, but 1 second first. Nate, can you just remind us of the specific language that says 30% and then how we wrote it for the overlay? And is the overlay actually less? It is, right?
It depends. So I think what happened during the overlay is the kind of conversation said, well, we really want the street facing area to
Right,
have this. And so rather than just a gross 30% floor area of the entire building, it's really important that the street facing facade has some activity. And so it could be that, you know, given the shape of a building, it might end up being, 10 or 15% is really the mixed use piece on University Drive because there's the back of part of the building that, you know, isn't part of that equation.
right.
Um, and
But so right now it's 30% of the floor area of
yeah,
the first floor.
yes, yeah, it says that at least 30% of the gross floor area of the first ground floor.
Okay.
So
And then we had relaxed it by saying 70% of the frontage.
right.
And was the depth calculated based on some other size or it was just a fixed depth?
It was a minimum at least, 24 or something feet. And that was the thought was that, if you do usually like a double loaded a single corridor and
Right.
most buildings are not more
Space in
than
the back.
60
Yeah.
feet. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I mean, I'd be interested in entertaining something like that for downtown, but maybe not 75%, but something that could be a little less, but keep the frontage. And what I like about that is even if, so let's say a developer decides they want to minimize to our standard, maybe we get smaller spaces in the commercial space, which I think is a positive, frankly.
Yeah. So and just quickly this, so, I'll do a new share. Mixed use buildings are allowed in a few zones. So we wouldn't change the BG or BL. So downtown would still stay 30%. This would be in outlying areas. So business village center, neighborhood business, and commercial. Um, and so here, so here's, kind of currently what we have for mixed use buildings where they're allowed. So it's these, few districts. So what we're talking about is changing in the BVC, BN, and commercial, these conditions right here, this 30%.
Right. Okay, so not everywhere, just there.
Just those, yeah. So right. I mean, that could be discussed, right? That was kind of that was the idea floated that we wouldn't change it for downtown. So the BG and BL would stay this 30%. Or it
And
maybe it changes. But anyways,
right, and the thinking there is that we want more commercial in downtown, I assume, right?
yeah, yeah, right,
But then maybe this other idea of frontage and some minimum depth could accomplish that too.
right.
Okay, I'll stop talking. Fred, go ahead.
Bruce, I may be confused here. Was Mandy supporting zero lot line construction?
That
Or were we just talking about the actual floor area?
she was
I'm a little bit confused.
she was concerned that we were at University Drive asking for too much of the first floor area to be maintained in a kind of a business commercial use. That was the topic of the conversation exclusively for the whole of the time we talked. So it's just this question of how much of the floor area of the first floor in these zones is to be dedicated to non-residential uses, I guess, essentially.
All right. Thank you for the clarification.
Angus, you're up.
Thanks. So I'm gonna maybe ask a slightly push this in a slightly different direction. Um, Nate, part of what it seems like developers are doing is they can't build big giant apartments. And so they build the workaround is to build mixed use buildings, right, that are primarily filled with apartments. So they're using the mixed use building because it's the only pathway to build large apartments in this town. But they're not using it in the way that we intend mixed use buildings to be used. But it's because we've capped apartment sizes. Is that correct?
Essentially.
Okay. And so what we're talking about here is trying to make it easier for them to build large apartment complexes with smaller amounts of mixed use space, with smaller amounts of commercial space outside of the village center.
Well, yeah, so I think the idea of this 30%, it was at first we allowed mixed use buildings without any standard. And so we had maybe 2 or 3 projects that came forward and they had, like 70 University Drive, for instance, down on University Drive, that's a mixed use building. So they have 36 units and they have like a 200 square foot office.
Right.
And then we had another one where again, it was like this, minimal square foot dedicated to the mixed use. And so we said, wow, that's not actually what we want, what we thought was going to happen. So then we did this 30%. And it seemed like it was okay, right? So in the downtown, we had these mixed use buildings. Agree with Jesse that sometimes it takes a while to fill the space, but I think the idea was we want to allow that space to happen, to be there and built that way because, the housing market is so strong that if you just said apartments, you would actually probably build out the downtown with apartments on the first floor and you wouldn't ever have any opportunity for for non-residential. What we've heard more recently is that 30%, because you could have a building that's like an L shaped, right? And like half the building isn't along the street, but that 30% is still calculated. And so what we've heard is that it actually becomes difficult for financing. They might have a few thousand square feet, 5,000 square feet or whatever to try to actually fill, and there's not a market for it. Um, so
So I guess I'm the reason I'm asking this is that I think it's fine to think about trying to relax some of this in outlying town centers. But I guess I'm also wondering if part of what we're trying to get at is making it easier for people to build what is mostly apartments, then another option for us to consider instead of making changes to mixed use buildings is to do the other thing to the housing production plan, and that Nate, you've brought up at different occasions, which is to redefine apartments, and to open up the more zones to possibly site plan review for apartments, which and the other benefit of that is that my understanding is if we are doing things that expand housing options and move things from site plan to or special permit to or no to site plan review or yes, it only requires a bare majority of the town council. So I guess I feel like developers are misusing the mixed use building right now. And what I'm hearing from Bruce and Jesse is that there's a reason we have this mixed use building use within our bylaw, and we're nervous about doing things that would sacrifice those goals, which are to have commercial space. But I guess my feeling is outside of the town center, if people want to build large apartment complexes, like I don't know, down by Atkins Market, maybe a bad example, but or some of these other key places, to me, like let's let them build a larger apartment complex, because those are not particularly walkable areas currently in any case. I don't think we need to worry so much about foot traffic to a first floor of a building there. And the only path, I mean, this was the part of the challenge with the Atkins project, right? They were trying to think about, it was a mixed use project, correct? And so they were trying to create all of this ground floor commercial space, some of which sounded really cool. But some of which I also, like one of them was maybe an early childhood center, which raised a lot of questions. Anyway, but my point is just if the goal is to make it easier to build apartments on more of the building, then I kind of wonder if we should just tackle the apartment thing. Sorry, that was long-winded.
Yeah. No, I think the way you're thinking about it is correct. I would largely agree. At the same time, yeah, it becomes difficult to me to think, well, in all these other areas, we should just let big apartments happen. Because I'm not convinced that's what we want to happen. And I also think wherever there are big apartments, there's value for commercial space. So it's so that's, I know I'm talking in circles. But I think you are correctly seeing certainly the issue that I would guess the developers are facing, because they really just want to build apartment buildings. Bruce, go ahead.
Um, I I'm not so concerned, Angus, about the way in which the mixed use building section of the bylaw is being used to essentially build apartments, but apartments with these kind of limitations on the first floor. I think that's okay. I don't feel like I mean, sometimes, you could say, well, this is an unintended consequence, but I don't think that's where we are with this. I don't think this is so it's an apartment. We're using the mixed, as you say, we're using we're letting mixed apartments come through this mixed use window. Um, but because we spent so much time with this mixed use, and we've kind of been tweaking it so that we can essentially let this happen in a controlled way. If we go back to the apartment side of things, we have to start again in a way. So I would say I wouldn't argue against doing that, but I think we should run the course with the mixed use building first. And I think that the suggestion that the standard in the outlying districts could be different. It should be different from the RG and the BL. The other thing that you mentioned, well, actually wasn't mentioned, I think Nate just typed it in, which was waivers. One of the platforms that I came in on when I was interviewed for this position on the planning board was that I supported planning boards, particularly in towns with well-developed staff and that the board has a good, solid professional support. I think allowing discretion on boards like ours is a good thing. So I would say it might be a good thing then to couple what was suggested about relaxing this percentage in the outlying districts, as well as putting some waiver provision in that allowed developers to make their case. So it gave us the power to deal with what might be called particular circumstances. So it means we have a sharper instrument. If we have a sharper instrument, if the town trusts the planning staff to guide the board well, and if it trusts the board to be intelligent and thoughtful and responsible. And I think that both of those things are reasonable in this town. So I would say that we could also contemplate giving the board something like the kind of discretion that we have with parking. That we could look at a site, and if a developer can make a case as to why the particular circumstances, situation, or what have you of the site, such as the Atkins site, and maybe that's what will be coming back to us, because if Kyle pulled out, not for reasons specifically related to the fire and the fact that he was just overwhelmed, but also because the wetland constraints were more than he anticipated, and so now he needs to have a different economic formula to make it work. My guess is, Angus, you really hit the nail on the head with that property, because I think that if we had the waiver provisions there, that we could work with Kyle to sort out what was a good balance. It seems a perfect candidate. I think it's a very good case study for us to think about vis-a-vis the other projects that Archipelago have done in the downtown, where we might not want to do that.
Yeah.
So I like the refinements of the two refinements that have been suggested as being good constructive additions to the bylaw.
Nate, do you want to jump in? Fred? No?
Right. We can let Fred make a comment.
Fred, go ahead. Fred?
I I agree. I also want to point out, I would want to limit it to a waiver and not just eliminate it. I want to point out that commercial space is more effective than residential space in terms of generating property taxes, which is another major point that Amherst has to look at. So I wouldn't. I would be against just removing the requirement, but a waiver provision might make sense.
So maybe we can simplify and complicate at the same time in all these regions and say, okay, either 30% of floor area, first floor, or whatever, 90% of frontage to half depth, or you get a waiver.
Yeah.
Nate, go ahead.
I would suggest not that. And I'll share a zoning map. Um, so I think there's the as Bruce, you're talking the waiver. The other thing that occurred to me is that in the commercial district, mixed use buildings are allowed, but we have the 4,000 square foot additional lot area per unit, um, which you know, doesn't apply, say, in other districts. And so there's this other piece. I think, so for BVC, for instance, a lot of our village centers, Pomeroy, Atkins, East Amherst, BVC is kind of some of the main zoning within that core. And so, Angus, to your point, I wouldn't want to say let's just now allow apartments because I do think the demand for housing would push so much that we could get developments and we'd actually then lose the ability to have commercial space on those buildings. As part of the downtown design standards, I think the consultant Dodson and Flinker has said maybe in some areas you allow apartments, but you require the first floor to be built out or framed at a height or something so that it could be later converted to commercial, but you don't require the commercial to go in there at first. I don't know, like how, like would that actually then change, right? Like I think you have to be really careful because, that happened actually with a building in town where it was a mixed use building and then a restaurant wanted to come in, but there was no, places within the building for chases, for events to go up. So then they were like, oh my gosh, we have to run an event on the outside of the building for 4 floors to get above the roof. And so there wasn't any consideration to actually have commercial in there because, I think if we just, anyways, so there's a few different ways we could do this. I kind of like the idea of the 75% of the front to a depth of a certain depth, what we did on University Drive and maybe try that in the BVC commercial and
Yeah, I think I'm okay
RVC.
with that. Can we talk about the 75% though? Why not more? Is
I
that just
think,
to allow access and stuff like that? And is that a reasonable need? Is that the right percentage need for that? Seems a lot.
I think the 75% was that, the concern would be if you have some area dedicated to serve the upper floors and you say had 100%, you would,
Right, I
you're in
understand maybe 100
violation.
is too much, but I mean, realistically, is 25% needed for that?
When we did University Drive, I spoke with, like John Kuhn and a few others, and they were saying 15 to 20% is kind of what you need to have um, ancillary space, whether it's stairwells, mailbox room, support space for the upper floors on the ground floor. So,
Well,
it could be
but
right on the front. And so that's why they, could be 80. I don't know, but I think we felt comfortable. It's only a minimum, right? So it's a minimum requirement. They could do more if it works for the building, but we're saying you can't do less. So if you have a 100-foot building, 75 feet has to
right,
be non-residential space
right.
at a minimum. You could do the whole thing. Um, but
But yeah, I'm just debating, because they have the whole back half of the building where that stuff could be too. Obviously not the access. So there
right,
needs to be something,
right.
but yeah,
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
I could be convinced 75% is right. I also think I like that idea of just switching from the 30% model to this in these districts and see what happens. Right?
Yeah, I mean, or I would do the 30% in a waiver, like what Bruce suggested. And if there were a waiver, maybe I'd still want to have a minimum. To me, it's like if someone came in as a mixed use building and then they said, we're going to waive all of it, that's an apartment building.
Right.
So you still have to have some mixed use space. Um, so to me, I think what the planning board, said on University Drive was we really like the idea of trying to activate the streetscape. And I agree. I think if we allow this more development in these village centers, those spaces are going to become valuable as commercial, retail, whatever, non-residential space. Uh,
Yeah.
Angus, go ahead.
I guess I'm just trying to navigate this I mean, y'all all have more experience on the planning board than I do. We have sort of an aspirations here to shape development in the town. And then, but then we're also coming up with the reality of what developers are willing to do, feel is cost effective to do. And it seems like we have a tension there, right? And so our work on this is trying to resolve some of that tension by um, sacrificing a little bit of our goals in the hopes of getting things actually built. Um, so I don't know. I'm not sure that I really have a question so much as this seems like a conundrum to me because
Yeah.
I share all of y'all's. I mean, like I lived in Philadelphia where there were constantly debates that felt very real and important about what ground floor space was doing, how we were creating communal spaces, how we were creating commercial spaces. And yet, when I think about some of our BVC areas and some of our commercial areas, the streetscape is not particularly desirable. We want it to be, and I share that desire. But at the same time, if developers aren't willing to build it, then we can sit here for years with desires, and that's not going to mean anything. So I guess I don't know how you all have thought about this. Maybe this is an existential thing for the planning board,
Yeah.
but it's something I'm struggling with here.
Yeah, I think it is, and you're right, we have struggled with this. I always feel like, no, we shouldn't change our goal to meet the current developer's needs, because it's kind of a one-way decision. I mean, like Nate was pointing out, oh, you build a certain height, but then it's never gonna happen, it's never gonna get changed. Just like a single-family house that becomes a rental, realistically is never gonna go back to a single-family house. And so it feels like important decisions, and I lean towards the not being reactive to financial goals of the developer, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, just quickly, I'm sharing my screen, and this is we call it the Pomeroy Village area. And so, here's the new roundabout, here's Speedway. And so this is all BVC. And so I think um, what we're saying right now is if, someone came in, they put a new building in, 30% of this has to be um, non-residential space. On University Drive, we would say that, 75% of this and this to a certain depth has to be. And the thing there is, like, if you have a building, say someone builds here and they, want to do something like this, I think what we're realizing is, this is where it kind of gets difficult. 30% of this has to be
Eh,
the non-residential space. But if to a depth of 24 feet, maybe you're looking at, this. That may be less than 30%, but what is the point of the mixed use building? Is it to have this be an active space? And it's only a minimum, right? So I would still have this be a minimum. They can always do more. But if this
Yeah.
were 30%, they might say, well, now I have to do this extra area. And
But Nate, what you drew first was 30% of the total area.
You think this was 30%?
Of the total area, yeah, I think it probably is close to it.
Yeah, I mean, so it might be a wash. I just, what if this
Yeah.
building had what if it was like a
I-
U? Anyways, I'm just, I think
Yes, I can. Yes.
Point taken. I think I'm fine with the 75% frontage idea.
Yeah.
And I'm also fine with the waiver possibility, you know, depending, I don't
mean,
always like that, because depending on the composition, people might feel differently. We could end up
Right.
with a big apartment building with no frontage.
And so, yeah, to me, I said we could stop the conversation here. I was going to put out there some of my questions were like, would we also change like additional lot area or height or other things related to mixed use buildings? But if we just said in BVC, RVC, and commercial, we're going to the 75%, that's a pretty straightforward change, and it might have some impacts. And we're not going to change any dimensional standards or anything else. We're not going to do additional lot area per family. And maybe that would change with additional studies and more research. But this could be something that, to me, still gets the goal of trying to have an active streetscape and not, and I think it was Jesse, you said, we still could research changing apartments or something, but that's part of a bigger, we have a consultant to look at East Amherst. And so maybe we think this is a good first step. And what happens out of the consultant this year is maybe we have to have a whole nother idea. But this affects more than just East Amherst, this change, right? It's all BBC.
I guess.
I still think the idea of a waiver is worth thinking about because this is such a finely finessed and complicated detail of buildings, and my sense is that if the developer can make their case, and the caveat was that the board has to be well supported and it has to be a decent, responsible body to begin with. If you have a waiver, you should have a goal statement, and I think that can be put in a sentence as well, which is essentially we want to preserve commercial. We want to preserve on-street vitality, and we see that commercial presence is important to that. So that statement, just like that, gives future planning boards a reason why it is that the 30% was there, and why, if they change that, there should be particular circumstances on the current application or site situation that would not contravene the goal statement. So I'm comfortable with the idea of trusting future boards to make this decision based on considered opinion, considered argument by the applicant to explain why it is they deserve it, why it is in the interest of the town that a waiver should be granted to them.
Angus, please.
Yeah, I think a waiver is fine as long as there's still some requirement for some amount of commercial space, because then it would have to, right, it would need to still be a mixed use building. So I think it couldn't go to zero.
No, I agree.
Although, Bruce, your idea, I mean, like, it could go to zero if we shift over to thinking about apartments. But I think your points earlier were great on that. So I won't go there. But I guess one of the things that I'm also thinking about, like, I drive through that Pomeroy roundabout all the time. That is not a walkable, or like that. I understand that we might have a vision of trying to turn that into a walkable, nice space, but right now it's entirely car centric. And most of our business village center areas, apart from the one up north in North Amherst on Meadow Street, which seems, although honestly, a lot of the triangle development stuff is, or the Mill District is more commercial maybe, but like that's really the only area that feels of our business village center areas that feels some amount of walkable.
I agree, but I think it's terrible. So I don't think we should let that guide us. I also think, in my mind, the commercial space is not just for walking traffic, it's for more commercial things to happen, even if someone's driving there, right?
I think my what I'm trying to say is, like, what the buildings that Nate just put up, I think that's along a bus route. And if we could get 2 apartment buildings built there that housed a bunch of people, that would be, to me, without mixed use space on them. To me, that would actually be okay in that area, because I just don't see that area developing in a way where there's going to be people walking around a bunch. So that's just what I want to. I just want to flag that I think there's also we have some competing goals. We want to have mixed use developments with commercial space for the tax reasons that Fred mentioned, right? For the kind of goals of creating a livable, walkable city or town. At the same time, we also have goals for housing, and they're kind of in tension here with this mixed use thing, at least according to developers. So, would I want those apartments to be put in the Mill District in North Amherst? No, I think like that's we're really building something there. But I don't know about these other business village centers that have been zoned this way for a long time and have not produced commercial development with apartments above them.
Yeah, fair point. Okay, are we ready to move on, Nate? Got what you needed on that front, maybe?
Yeah, no, I think they're all really nice considerations and ideas. I would say that if we say that village center I showed, my thought would be as if, say, someone came forward and said, "Oh, I want to, redevelop this property." We would encourage them to have wide sidewalks, a streetscape, and we start building it into that fabric. And it could happen with apartments too. I think the difficulty is, say, in the BBC zone, kind of like what I said, if we say, "Oh, now we allow apartments," I think they would outcompete, mixed use buildings. And so we probably wouldn't see any mixed use buildings. And, at some point, do we have is that okay, or do we try to preserve it somehow? I just think that, as Jesse said, in the long run, we might want that some space to be non-residential space. And I don't know if, if we would have just given up that opportunity. It's hard to say exactly if we would have, but
Yeah,
Okay,
I guess.
I'm sorry, I don't want to belabor this point too much,
sure.
but I guess how long have those spaces been
Right.
zoned this way? I mean, it's not like a last few years the market has changed, right? I mean, like some of these things we've tried for like 20 or 30 years, with some of these mixed use options, right? With the business village center and the resident village center, and the goals were to create little pockets of I'm presuming, because that's the goal with most of these kinds of zoning approaches, is to create kind of pockets of walkability, right, where people live a little bit more denser. And there's some of that has happened, but I want to raise some skepticism that we have the power to kind of force the market to do things when it at least hasn't seemed to have worked in some of those
Yeah.
areas.
I largely agree. And at the same time, I think, okay, what if, I don't know, 2,000 students suddenly live in that exact area? Then there'll be a lot of need for more commercial things, and we will have eliminated the opportunity. So I wonder if there's a way to do both, somehow to allow apartments. I don't know what the zoning would look like, what the requirements would be, to allow bigger apartments that are maybe not on the, don't have frontage somehow, or some of those lots look big enough to build something behind to allow more space in the front for that eventuality. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there could be other things like in BVC, we do say 3 floors max. We could go a floor higher with a special permit. So it's like, do we actually need to say 4 floors in the BVC? No special permit required, but maybe we take some design standards and we apply it, to soften the extra height. And so that, it could be that there's a few things, not just right, that the BVC, the goal of the BVC, I guess I agree, but maybe we didn't quite get there in terms of, say, our additional lot area, our dimensional standards or whatever. And so it's kind of, I think mixed use, what we're doing, say if we do the 75% or the waiver, that's one step. And maybe the next step is we have to increase the height with design standards or something, because 3 floors really maybe isn't tall enough. I don't know exactly why they wouldn't be. I also think sometimes someone at one point, I used the word like legacy property owners, right? Not here, but at some other meeting. And it's like, yeah, I think a lot of those properties, they're making money for the owners and they're satisfied, right? There's no reason to redevelop and take under that complex project. And so maybe market pressures will change that, but right now they're comfortable, and so they don't really need to do anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. We're clearly not going to get through all these topics, Nate.
No.
So is there one that needs more attention than others to talk
No,
about?
I think that's no. I think this is it. This is fine. I think so. I took some more notes under mixed use buildings, and I think to me, I would I can refine this and it can be in the planning board packet, and just it's something we can keep working on. I think for student homes, or student housing, it'd be great to kind of understand what are some questions the subcommittee has here. Like what are things we'd want to see? And so I sent out, I just added like 2 right now. Could we, say prohibit students from a site plan review subdivision? If we define a student dwelling, could we somehow limit student dwellings in a mixed use building or apartment building? To me, this would just be like, provide your questions or comments or what you are interested in seeing. And it can be positive, it could be others, like, is it an enforcement regulation? If we define it, can we allow it in other places? I mean, so I think what staff would like to do, we've heard, the planning board and, others talk about this. And I think we really need to kind of start researching this. We can research it with our legal team, with other towns, kind of what are we allowed to do in terms of, say, students?
Yeah.
And so this is kind of just like, I don't really have anywhere this is going. I'd be curious to know your questions. Like, what would you like to see if we say?
Yeah. Just one slight edit. Probably you meant, can we prohibit student homes, right? Not, or student houses from an SPR, not students themselves? Or
Right.
Actually,
Right.
don't want to get that'll definitely make people upset if we're worded that way.
You might want to put student homes in quotation marks so that it has the implication is that it's a it's a thing, you know. It's
Yeah, or yes,
Yeah.
agreed.
Yeah.
I mean that
well, then below on 4, you've got student dwelling unit. I think it has to be a student home as well.
Student
I mean,
home, yeah. Okay, yeah.
and whether it's a student home or a student house is another just semantic thing, because homes sounds very touchy-feely and house is more clinically cold. I don't know whether we want to be warm or cool on this, but the differences between whether it's a student home or a student house, which is the commodity or whatever that we are discussing here.
yeah, I guess Nate, I wonder your second point there, can the town define one? Is that really a question? Don't we know we can if we want to?
I
Then
guess
the
you're saying
question
it's
is- then the
will
question
the
is how we
town,
use it and if it's a okay use, right?
Well, I think the question is then if we think we can, is it, I'm not sure we maybe can in zoning, actually.
Well, right, but that's then the second part question. I mean, I feel like I haven't encountered anything, Bruce, you've thought of this a lot more, that says, no, you cannot define something this way.
Uh,
It's how you might apply it, the definition, or you try and use the definition, right? Maybe I'm
uh, there-
wrong.
I mean, there's there's fair housing law and other things that this may butt up against. Some people could say, well, students aren't a protected class. So anyways, I think it's, to me, it's still a question just worth asking, just
Okay.
generically.
I mean, I said this more than once. I feel like each time we've asked our town council about things, the response is, well, maybe, but that will definitely result in litigation, so you shouldn't do it. And I don't agree with that position, but I'm not also paying for it. So, well, I kind of am paying for it, actually. Anyway, Fred, go ahead.
Yeah, we had a definition worked out as part of the discussion around accessory dwelling units. And I'm trying to remember now exactly that we didn't go forward with that. And I
we did
forgot
actually.
exactly.
The town didn't go
Well,
forward with it.
we did, and then the council said no, hard no. And then we also were talking about trying to include it in the ADU, and that got dropped. I'm not exactly sure why.
Okay, so that was a political decision.
Correct.
Thank you.
Angus?
I don't really, I think these questions are good, and I mean, if you're seeking legal opinion, then I would recommend keeping as many as you can and as many variants so that they get a sense that of all the things that we're asking. Um, but I'll just flag that I don't love this direction of trying to um regulate student housing in this capacity. I understand the desire to do it, and I've heard both other members of the board and the petitioners and people who've written about it talk about how this could be a possible route. To me, the supply issue is much more important. But so I don't really have anything to add. I think it would be helpful to have legal opinion so that we can figure out if this is something that we even would be wise to sink a whole lot more time into. So I think that would be a great decision. But I'll just flag my kind of um, unease about it.
Yep, understood. Thank you for that. Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah, more or less completely agree with Angus. I could stop there, but I won't, because in checking whether I completely agree with Angus, I could, and probably it would be a good idea for me to call the planning director at State College in Pennsylvania again. I spoke to Ed Leclerc about uh, about 2.5 years ago, and I got all of the data, or it's not the data, all of the information that is in that piece that I sent around when I've been talking to towns and so forth. I think it would be good to check in with him to see whether there's been any change in the minimum distancing regulations, the kind of kind of heavy-handed and complicated regulations that are that this whole discussion topic implies. I think I know that the town, Rob Morrow and others are not at all interested in this because they just see the administrative workload that would flow from almost any decision that would be made and adopted in this realm. And particularly so far as minimum distancing and so. So if I were to go back and see if I can get hold of Ed and talk to him again, and find out whether it's anything has changed in 2 years, and you get because it seems that that's the only jurisdiction that we know of in the country that has basically gone down this path. And so checking in again is probably a good thing to do. But my guess is that having checked in, I will still feel as I did a moment ago that I would basically be in Angus's court on this one.
Yeah. Well, only thing I would add, and I'll also kind of very brief, is that I agree supply is the main problem we're facing. But I don't think we can build enough quick enough to prevent some neighborhoods from just becoming completely rentals.
Mhm.
That's why I'm interested in pursuing other ways to minimize.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna
So
just jump in quickly. I think there was a student home definition as part of the ADU discussion. The council had a lot of questions and didn't move it forward. I think the reason we're asking, Jesse, is because what you just said, right? I think we've heard it now. I think Jeff heard it. We've been hearing it. So there's kind of two kind of maybe points there. One is if we allow more development, it'll be mostly students, and the worry about conversion of single 1 and 2 family homes to student rentals. And so I added this question: could a student home only apply to 1 and 2 family dwellings? Whether or not I think it's a great idea. It's just, to me, this was just you can send me questions after this meeting. It's just trying to get these are the things we want to follow up with. And so, because to Jesse's point, I think supply is important, but I don't think we can get there fast enough. And so, is there, for instance, ways to protect certain neighborhoods that could be mostly 1, 2s, and say 3 families, and then allow for more development in other areas? But if we have the student home definition, maybe we can use it in those neighborhoods. For instance, I think it's a
Okay.
worthwhile effort to ask these questions.
So another question to me on this list then is, can we regulate amount, percentage, distance of just rentals? Take the student out of it. Again, that's a little antithetical to some other goals of allowing workforce and young family housing, perhaps, but that to me is a valuable question to ask also. Even if we're not defining who, can we define a rental and
So
regulate that?
you're basically putting it another way, Jesse. You're saying, can we regulate requiring owner occupancy?
Correct.
Yeah, so typically on anything that would be allowed by right, say single family homes, 2 family homes, zoning can't get into that kind of that piece. So, but I think it's a question
So,
to ask.
but maybe, all right, can we also, if we're going down this road to ask
Yeah.
someone for legal opinion,
Yeah.
maybe it's not a zoning, like can the town, even if it's not in the zoning law, is it like, can the town do that in any way is really my question. Maybe it's not this group. Maybe it has to be CRC, some other proposal to council having nothing to do with zoning. I don't know.
Well, if for example we've got a rental bylaw, and in order to rent a house, you need to have a permit to rent your house. So I guess your
Right,
question could
exactly.
be rephrased as: does the town have the capacity to reject a request for a rental permit? Yeah,
Right.
or could we
Not
provide
capacity
bases?
and effort, capacity and
Yeah.
ability,
Yeah.
legal ability, authority.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess
So-
I'm swayed a little from my position of fully supporting Angus. I mean, I still support Angus in the general principle of trying to regulate this, but I think that there might be particular places, and I guess even the local historic district commission, because I've been on that now for quite a long time. I know in my conversation with Cinda, she said, as I said, that was a very wide-ranging discussion. Nowhere near as focused as the conversation I had with Mandy Jo Haneke. With Cinder, it was all over the map, and one of the outlying areas of the map that we visited was her notion that, well, the center of town, basically historic center of town, is right in in the catchment of UMass. It's right next to it. We should just let it become it should all go to student rentals. That I think I heard it correctly, but it's certainly, and I thought, well, that's interesting. How do I feel about that? And of course, after a while, I thought, well, that's completely at odds with the goals of the local historic district, because we think we know that if the place was fully, let's say, substantially or completely student rentals, it would look like the bottom end of Meadow Street, which is to say, landlords who care little or nothing about the building and little or nothing about the landscape around the building. There would be paving everywhere. There would be cars everywhere. There would be buildings that were not being maintained. It would be the worst outcome from the goals and aspirations of the local historic district commission
So
imaginable.
had I had the foresight, I would have done this on McClellan Street just by documenting, because it's happened since the time I've lived here. That I don't know how familiar you all are with those streets, but from Page to Country Park, when I first moved here, was largely owner occupied, and now it's, I think, 90% or so rented, and it's dramatically different. That's just in 15 years or so. Anyway, Angus, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, to me, the central problem is, where are students going to funnel? And that whole downtown area. I agree with you, Bruce. Like, the idea of housing all of our students is going to run into conflict with other goals that we have. But at the same time, the master plan also delineates that doing infill development in areas that, yes, might have more historical character, actually, but at the same time are close to UMass, are close to major, transit routes, are already a little bit more built up, are closer to different kinds of commercial services, in ways that these, single family homes aren't. Those are great places to build up apartments, potentially mixed use buildings. So, I hear your concerns. At the same time, like, something's got to give, and something is giving. And right now, it's just we're pushing single family single families out. So we might have a more historically coherent downtown area, but it means that we have a more incoherent, residential area right outside of that.
Yeah.
I think just I'm looking at the time, we might have to end soon. I took some notes. I would encourage, members, if you have any thoughts, you can always mark up the document or any documents and send them to me, and I can, synthesize it. And I'd like to, share this with the planning board, and kind of, the other priorities just quickly were, cottage style development. So, allowing multiple principal dwellings. And I said single family duplexes and townhouses on a single property. And, that's something that, you know, uh, we can discuss, how, is that kind of another kind of missing kind of middle density kind of solution. Then this neighborhood subdivision method, kind of akin to 40Y. I think, what I've asked, and I kind of understood that we probably couldn't, we can't really limit the size of a dwelling unit in zoning, right? So 40Y takes that approach because the state allows it to, 1,850 square feet, like 3 bed, 1.5 bath, whatever it is. We can't do that in zoning. So kind of a big question is, if we allow smaller lots, do we still want to move forward with this? Doug had said,
Right, sorry, I just want to understand what you're saying. If we allow smaller lots, you're saying we probably cannot limit the size?
so like what Bruce said at the planning board meeting is that, you could take a 50 by 100 lot, which is quite small, 5,000 square feet. You could have your setbacks, but you still could have like a 2,000 square foot building.
Yeah, more than that, actually.
And you're saying we can't limit that?
We cannot. Whereas like 40Y would say you can do these 50 by 100, but the maximum size of a dwelling in a 40Y subdivision is 1,850 square feet. And we can't do that through zoning. And, Doug asked, how many properties would be developed using this? And he was thinking it's not a lot, and is it worth pursuing? So, I think it's something we had talked about. People were kind of excited in the subcommittee. So if we can't limit the size of the home, do we still like this idea of trying to come up with a new subdivision method to allow smaller lots on narrower roads? And maybe it gets used in some places.
Yeah.
More recently, our cluster, our open space, our other development methods have not been used
Yeah.
in our bylaw. So
Okay, I'll respond to these offline.
Yeah.
I've also written a 1,200 word piece related to the general question of student housing, which I was going to send out, but I thought I wouldn't. I'll send it to anybody who's interested in, because this is the goal of this is to put it in to propose it to the bulletin as a sequenced opinion piece. So I'm going to send it to you, Jesse, and I'll send it to
Yes.
anybody else who wants to
Great.
help me make it a better article.
Thanks for doing that, Bruce.
Mhm.
Okay, yeah, I'll send you some thoughts on these other pieces too, Nate.
oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, that'd be great.
Okay, sorry
Okay,
to be short today. See you all at planning board, I think, next.
next week, I think, isn't it?
All
Thanks,
right.
y'all.
Thanks.
Right.
Planning board is the 25th, right? We end up,
Oh, yeah.
it's next week's,
That's right.
yeah, we're not meeting. All right.
Oh,
Okay.
okay, nobody.
Thanks.
See ya.